Just tell me when you're ready to go. Hey guys, I am Raven,
I'm Luke.
I'm Sandhya.
and this is another episode of Labor Unchained. So today we are going to be talking about the blockade that's been going on in Cuba, and a little bit of the recent protests that have been going on. So Luke, did you just want to start us off with the first question?
Yes. Okay. I just kind of want to generally introduce the idea of the blockade. What is this blockade? How is it affecting Cuba? How is it affecting the Cuban people? And specifically, what is the purpose of this blockade from the United States perspective? People from the United States might not understand why this blockade is here and why they have this state sponsors of terrorist designation. So, do you have any elaborations on that?
Yeah, so just to kind of summarize overall, the blockade is what we refer to as the, zillions of U.S. sanctions against Cuba, both economic, political, travel-based, trade-based, that have existed and kind of accumulated over the last 60 plus years. And that started with the Mallory memo that, the first U.S. sanctions against Cuba were put into effect by Eisenhower, really with the purpose of undermining the Cuban Revolution and the purpose of also undermining the gains of the revolution and the will of the people to sustain the revolution as well. The Cuban Revolution and socialism was incredibly popular with the people. And so the U.S. saw sanctions, one, as a strategy to take down the revolution, but also specifically to create discontent among the people. So how do they do that? They attempt to starve the people. They attempt to isolate Cuba from the rest of the world. As the U.S. at this point was since, the late 18th or the late 1800s started to develop itself as an imperial power in the world. So it was using this kind of, its station that it's creating for itself as an international bully to figure out the ways that it can keep other countries and other nations from interacting with Cuba. And so that's how these sanctions were put into place and kind of have builded upon themselves across Democratic and Republican presidencies. To really put a stranglehold on the people, and with the goal of eventually creating counter-revolutionary movements.
Yeah. I also want to bring up kind of what you were saying about keeping Cuba, the successes of the revolution down. If we think about the context of the post-revolutionary Cuban period, the United States was not just in Cuba. They were all over Central and South America. They were launching an entire campaign in that part of the Southern Hemisphere, an imperialist campaign specifically. So to undermine the Cuban Revolution is very important for that imperialist campaign to succeed, so that it does not inspire other movements and gain movements of socialists in those other South American, Central American countries. We see them prop up dictatorships in Chile and crush revolutions in Argentina and all these other places, in the context also of sanctioning the successful socialist revolution in Cuba. So it's all part of a larger geopolitical strategy of the United States as imperialists.
Yeah, and I was gonna say too, in the current state of affairs too, everything that the U.S. does very strategically in Latin America and the Caribbean is to make an example out of Cuba. Cuba itself is an example to the world as a stronghold against U.S. imperialism, one that its project sustains through all of these attacks, through sanctions, through terrorist designations, through the information war, through mass propaganda, But because of, Cuban medical internationalism, because of, so many Cubans who have participated in, and fought in liberation movements, liberation struggles across the world, and have very firm political stances when it comes to opposing all U.S. interventionism, opposing Zionism, opposing South African, takeover and colonialism, or the white South African colonialism. I think the U.S. also tries to figure out strategically how to create these choke points in the Caribbean and Latin America to also make sure those like relationships of solidarity that are building across those regions get turned against Cuba as well. So like one thing that a lot of us have been discussing and thinking about is the fact that U.S. intervention and invasion of Haiti, for example, would create even a further shortage of fuel in Cuba. It's already undergoing, fuel shortages and medical shortages, food shortages, flour shortages, but all of these other kind of points of tension and invasion and like the sponsorship of U.S. militarism and destabilization across these areas would only worsen the effects of the blockade on Cuba.
Yeah. So one thing I kind of wanted to ask you about specifically, so you are one of the founding members of the Michigan Action Committee for Cuba, right? Mm-hmm. So could you just give us like a quick rundown of like what MACC is, and then broader the parent organization of the NNOC? Kind of like just give us a rundown of like what do you guys do, and then specifically like maybe a little bit about the worker brigades that you guys have done that both you guys are going on in May.
Yeah, and Luke, feel free to bounce off that too, because Luke wasn't a part of MACC initially, but still really jumped into doing the solidarity work. So MACC stands for the Michigan Action for Cuba Committee, and those of us who came back from the 2023 National Network on Cuba International May Day Brigade came back with really the energy and the goal of combating the blockade from the belly of the beast. And we do that in alignment with the NNOC's main three goals. And the NNOC is a coalition that's comprised of revolutionary grassroots organizations, of Cuba Solidarity organizations, of revolutionary African and Caribbean organizations that are in alignment with its goals. So its three main goals are: one, to break the blockade, to break the U.S. blockade against Cuba; two, to remove Cuba off of the state sponsors of terrorism list, and that to remove that false designation; and three, to reclaim and give back Guantanamo Bay, which has been illegally occupied by the U.S. To Cuba, to Cubans. So how we organize locally, one, is by combating the information war. So making sure we, combat U.S. propaganda against Cuba with our own propaganda, by doing political education locally, by making connections with local organizing to global internationalist organizing. And that's not something that's like, it didn't just come up out of nowhere, and it for sure didn't start with us. Southeastern Michigan, especially Detroit, has such a rich legacy of connecting the struggles of especially Black Detroiters, of auto workers, of revolutionary grassroots organizing, to Cuban socialism, and really what socialism brought to the island in terms of, decolonialization and anti-racism and anti-capitalism. And so these ties are just, they already exist, but I think as, people on the brigades going on these brigades get younger and younger. It's our job to make sure that we reproduce this collective memory of solidarity between us. And yeah, so beyond making these connections between local revolutionary organizing, local community organizing, and Cuba, across Detroit, across southeastern Michigan, we also organize material aid. And this isn't in the spirit of charity, right? It's not in the spirit of, we are saviors who are bringing, whatever we can because, we have a lot, they have nothing, we're better off. It's really more so that we're listening to the calls of Cubans who are telling us what they're experiencing shortages of because of policies of the country that we reside or settle in. And it is really our responsibility to make sure that we are subverting the blockade by bringing supplies like medicine, medical supplies, baby formula, flour, musical instruments, clothes. So all of these things are a part of what we do, and there's the above ground and below ground work too. Not everybody is a communist. Not everyone is a socialist. Not everyone, fully identifies, I would say, or has full knowledge of the Cuban Revolution, but knows at a base level that sanctions are acts of war, that sanctions are genocidal, that they kill people, and that, the U.S.'s relationship with Cuba is parallel to U.S.'s relationship with the colonized and oppressed people within these borders, within these colonial borders. So it's also our job to make sure that we're organizing among the masses, among the working people, whether or not they're leftist, according to what's important to them.
Yeah, just jumping in like this to actually get the sanctions lifted and to get Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorist list, it has to be a mass movement. And that is what MACC is organizing towards and NNOC is organizing towards, is a mass movement for the liberation of the Cuban people from these genocidal sanctions.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. One thing I kind of wanted to highlight on is Cuba's like self-sustainability. So as probably a lot of people watching this know, Cuba has one of the highest ratios of doctors per capita. They send doctors to other countries during disease outbreaks. Like we saw this back in like 2015, 2014. I'm kind of, I don't know the exact dates,
also
but COVID especially. A lot of doctors, especially during like the Ebola crisis in like 2014, 2015. And also during COVID, they, I'm pretty sure, created 2 of their own vaccines on their own. So could you just give us like a rundown on like Cuban self-sustainability and how Cuba has been able to survive even under these genocidal sanctions?
Yeah, so I mean, this is that's a
Socialism.
very dense socialism. It's a dense question, but really I think it's both how the state supports the people and the state is held accountable to and by the people in a way that is incomparable to imperialist capitalist states like the U.S. But it is also the spirit of the Cuban people, the spirit of creative resistance that really only comes out of being a people forced under a blockade. And yeah, so I one of the things that you brought up was the medical internationalism, and so Cuba really thrives off of, I think, 3 main goals of maintaining high literacy rates, so having a very rich educational system, having a very rich healthcare system, and a strong healthcare system that sustains even through the conditions of the blockade, even through medical shortages, even through the kind of punitive measures the U.S. takes to like prevent Cuba from purchasing medical supplies and making, medical supplies, medical equipment, medical technologies incredibly expensive and inaccessible to Cubans. So the system still thrives because, doctors in Cuba, when they go to school, they're not worried about how much money they're going to make. You don't become a doctor in Cuba for the money. You become a doctor because it's part of your anti-imperialist duty to serve the community, to serve the people. And so I mentioned healthcare, education. It's also popular democracy. So how communities, local communities, basically have a direct relationship with the state, with the president. Like, there's people that we visited when we were on the brigade who, had a direct tie to their local representative, who lived among them, who very easily communicated their concerns to the larger, federal body and to the president with regards to, the conditions that they desired in their communities. No one is homeless in Cuba. Everyone has the basics when it comes to food, ways to get around, and a livelihood. But all of these things, the state does its best to provide for the people. But, all of us, and I think everyone can resonate, like, we want more than just to survive, right? Even with our basic needs met, we want to experience happiness and joy and recreation and being able to interact with people across the world. Like, so many of us every day, you can't go one day here without, interacting with someone across the world through the internet. And just all of those, like, possibilities, all of those ways are just cut short and curtailed by the blockade, which, attempts to punish Cubans by cutting off their access to artists across the world, to scientists across the world, to musicians across the world. The U.S. blockade tries to make the world as small as possible for Cuba, which has done so much for people across the world. I'm starting to lose a little bit of track of the conversation.
You're totally fine.
I think you were asking about kind of how Cuba sustains itself.
Yeah. That was the general idea of my question.
Yeah. So
I thought you answered that very well. And I guess a follow-up clarification and question would be addressing protesting in Cuba, because people protest in Cuba just like any other country. It's a bit of a misnomer in the States, and it's part of the information war against Cuba,
right,
to kind of portray these protests as, the Cuban people are rising up against the government. They demand democracy, yada, yada. But can you clarify what those protests really are, and how does the Cuban government respond to protest movements of the people?
yeah, so I think the protests you're referring to, the recent protests in Santiago.
Yeah.
People came out to very peacefully communicate their relationship to the shortages. And one thing, there was a very quick, immediate response where the president himself was able to speak to the people. There was an effective communication between government officials, representatives, and the people themselves on the roots of the problem, like the real roots of the problem, because of how propaganda works, because of kind of the pervasiveness of the conditions of the blockade. It can be difficult, right, to realize that, you go through enough, then really all you care about is how to put food on the table, how to take care of your kids. And so they did a great job of communicating kind of, that the sources of these shortages are because of U.S. policy against Cuba. But one thing, as far as, how protests like these, right, communications between the people get really blown out of proportion. And I don't just mean like blown out of proportion as in made a bigger deal. I mean fully decontextualized. Or because of the really malicious efforts of the Gusano Mafia in Florida, and U.S. media outlets that, have it out for anti-imperialist socialist states and projects like Cuba, who find ways of organizing, just malicious propaganda and lie, just blatantly lie about how protests end up carrying out. Talking about how people are violently repressed, and speaking to brutality that didn't take place. All of this is projection, right? In the same way that Zionists project onto Palestinians what they do to Palestinians, the U.S. projects onto Cuba what the U.S. does to colonize and oppress people within its borders. And so I think the president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, had a really great kind of biting statement to offer on this, along the lines of, the people of Cuba recognize and see how the U.S. treats its own people, or the people within its borders, with violence, with, miscommunicate, or with disinformation, lying to them, making false promises, and then brutalizing them using law enforcement in ways that Cuba doesn't do. One, doesn't have the capacity to even do, but also would never do. Yeah. So I think if anyone wants to find out more about these protests, and how the people themselves are responding to the blockade, I think one really amazing strategy that's coming in from the U.S., from anti-imperialist organizing in the U.S., is to combat the information war, is having really clear messaging. And the National Network on Cuba published a really good statement on Instagram speaking to the context of these protests, speaking to the response, and really put a simple call, the fact that, the people are responding to the conditions that are coming out of this state sponsors of terrorism designation, and because of, these cruel and genocidal sanctions. So I can read a little bit. Maybe I'll read a little chunk out of it.
Sure.
Yeah. So it started with: the economic crisis and unrest in Santiago de Cuba underscores the devastating impact of over 6 decades of illegal U.S. sanctions, the no evidence-based designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, and the inflammatory financial manipulation which have led to shortages of fuel, electricity, and basic goods. Yesterday, people took to the streets in Santiago de Cuba, and this was published on March 18th, expressing their frustration at the recent power outages. Miami regime changers and U.S. government-funded propaganda outlets were quick to exploit these genuine frustrations into calls for the overthrow of the Cuban government. But this does not match the reality of the situation on the ground in Santiago, where the protests were completely peaceful and citizens engaged in dialogue with local leaders and law enforcement. So the U.S. response to really what is an internal problem and internal communications between the people and the government is always to overthrow the government, to get people on board with overthrowing their government, which every organized person, every worker in Cuba, every Cuban disagrees with.
Yeah, I think those are really good points to hit on. You've also been to Cuba yourself. You said you went on the 2023 May Day Brigade. So could you just give us like a quick rundown of like what your experience was like in Cuba? Like how did your perspectives change, and like what was your interactions like with the people of Cuba?
Yeah, and Luke too. And I know I've been talking a lot. I would want to hear about what is really intriguing to you about going to Cuba. I had a phenomenal time. I think the way that the itinerary for the brigade is set up is such that we attend lectures and get to speak with people in several industries and several fields of work, several fields of study. We also do voluntary labor and voluntary work at Cuban urban gardens. and organoponicos, I think is what it's called, organic gardens. We also have time to interact with the committees in defense of the revolution. So local representatives, we had time to attend speeches and panels with the president, with other Cuban representatives of government, and with representatives from across the world who were attending also as delegations. We came as the U.S. delegation, but because it was May Day, and May Day is celebrated with such aplomb and such love in Cuba. People from across Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Americas come to celebrate with one another, to participate in national and city marches. So we had the privilege of doing that. We were able to go, out of the city, out of Havana. And our interactions with the people, we got to hear a lot about really the ways, just witnessing the Socialist Project in action. Some of my most memorable interactions have been with artists and teachers and musicians and folks who are telling us about the ways that their unions work, and got to tell us about how the government guarantees them what was the word for it? Guarantees them, basically allowances for their work. So artists, unlike in the U.S., don't go homeless, don't go without a livelihood, because their supplies are paid for, because the Cuban government takes it upon themselves to make sure that art and culture are really important and seen to the people and accessible to the people. We got to interact with university students and kind of got to hear about the fact that, grades aren't of utmost importance, but rather their commitment to enriching their communities and to studying and being with their communities and giving back to their communities, learning how to be anti-imperialist in the spirit of Jose Marti. That is the priority in education there. And just had so many emotional interactions with people where, I don't know, you expect going in as an American or someone coming from the belly of the beast to be kind of greeted with hostility that would be warranted. But rather, the Cuban people showed us so much affection and showed us so much empathy. And that was one thing that was really hard to witness. The blockade not only keeps, interactions, technologies, goods from entering into Cuba, but it also keeps the services, the goods, the affections, the thoughts, and the information from the Cuban people from reaching us. Mm-hmm. So I remember hearing from the Cuban neuroscientists and doctors who spoke to us. They used the comparison of Michigan itself when they were talking about COVID, Cuba's amazing COVID response, their 5 vaccines, their almost 0 mortality rate when it came to COVID cases, and used Michigan as an example to compare to, because Michigan's population of almost 11 people is parallel to Cuba's population of roughly around 11 million people. And just the sheer difference in how many more people died of COVID in Michigan, they spoke to that with such empathy. It was incredibly emotional, and we had a lot of very emotional moments on the trip where it was just day after day of realizing the Cuban people have no choice but to know about our struggles and how and take it upon them, take it as a responsibility to respond to that. People were telling us how when Katrina happened, there were Cuban doctors ready to enter and to help assist the people, and they were kept out because of the blockade, because of travel restrictions. But yeah, just we constantly experienced that during the brigade. And And we did notice too. I mean, there's also, I think people use these points, and I've noticed this too. And I hate to say it, how like sometimes DSA can interact, or people who are more liberal can interact with what they see in Cuba. Mm-hmm. But I was just gonna say that like there you do witness people who will say like we have to work 2-3 jobs. We have to, you know, we really want to be able to leave the country and travel, and who express dissatisfaction over like the long fuel lines that they have to be in every morning, and you know, some concern over their children's livelihoods. And these are clear responses to the conditions of the blockade that I think not going in with that knowledge, going in with the malicious spirit of trying to undermine the Cuban Socialist Project, people purposefully misread that as you know, Cubans being against socialism. But yeah, these, you know, we approached these interactions with an open heart and open mind, because at the end of the day, you know, we're Americans in Cuba. So yeah, but it was a incredibly enriching brigade, and we all brought medical supplies with us on our brigade. So that was we were figuring out while we were there, how do we organize when we get back? Everything that we learn and witness here, how do we bring it back? Mm-hmm. How do we build a mass around you know, Cuba Solidarity work? And yeah, how do we break the blockade? So
yeah, absolutely. I think those are great points to hit on. So I guess for like anyone who's like watching this podcast right now or like listening to it, like how can they get involved? Like where can they go if they want to get involved with like the NNOC or get involved with like helping out Cuba and the Socialist Project going on in Cuba?
Yeah, so there's a lot of good touch points. I hate to just big up Instagram and all of these interactions because we're not social media organizers or influencers, or event planners, but
it is a good way to get our info.
It is a great way to, you know, get some quick information and know what we're doing locally. I would say follow the National Network on Cuba and Michigan Action for Cuba on Instagram. Again, if you want to find out more about brigades to Cuba, there are ways that we work as MACC to help orient people and help people figure out more about the really accessible ways there are to get to Cuba. The National Network on Cuba has their Mayday Brigade that's been going on for about 16, 17 years, is one that is curated to be as accessible and affordable to working class people as possible among all the other brigades, and it does prioritize Black and brown people too in who comes to the island. So I would say if you want more information on the conditions of the blockade, they have an amazing political education guide on their website, NNOC.org. They have more information on the brigades on their website. And if you want to find out what we're doing in terms of action, political education, material aid organizing, follow MACC, and keep up with us. And yeah, we can potentially help get you to Cuba too.
Yes, all of this stuff will be in the video description as well. So we will make it as easy as possible for people to get plugged in and to get educated. And I guess just before we end, because we're going to have to end here soon, I am very excited to go on the brigade. I will be the minority. Like you said, there's going to be a lot of Black and brown people, which is awesome. And I am coming primarily for two reasons. Firstly, just to understand and experience the Cuban Socialist Project. I'll be taking extensive notes. I'll be asking a lot of questions. I won't be there as someone who is trying to educate Cubans or educate my fellow brigadistas as if, you know, I have the higher moral ground. Like, I am there as someone to be learned and to be transformed by this experience. And from that transformation, I will secondly want to come back and learn how to organize even better as someone in MACC, as someone in CP, orientating our struggle towards lifting the blockade, getting them off the terrorist lists, and returning Guantanamo, the 3 NNOC points. So yeah, I'm very excited for this brigade.
Yeah, thank you so much for that comment. I really appreciate you kind of sharing your perspective on that, and also I really appreciate you coming out here and doing this. This was very informative, having a representative not only from MACC but NNOC, someone who's been to Cuba. I really appreciate you coming out and doing this interview and this podcast. And just to wrap this up, if any of you guys are interested in joining the NNOC, we will leave links in the description down below, whether on YouTube or whatever service you're streaming this on. If you want to know more about what's going on, I highly, highly, highly suggest going out and doing research. If you want to get involved, make sure to contact the NNOC. If you are within Michigan, specifically like the Detroit, Ann Arbor area and like Southeast Michigan, make sure to contact MACC. They can help you and get involved. And make sure to share this podcast. If you want to like educate more people, make sure to follow us on Labor Unchained. We'll be posting podcasts more frequently on not only just Cuba, but leftist solidarity and leftist movements in general. And yeah, this has been Labor Unchained, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.